That's right, the 1960s, the time of the Beatles, the time of Jimi Hendrix, and so much more. It was a very groovy time, baby. To be honest, 1960s, if you were around in 1960, the bands you were listening to or watching, they were in white shirts with a black tie and a black suit, kind of like the Blues Brothers without the hat and the glasses. Your TV was black and white. You probably did wear a hat. Most likely, yeah, most people wore hats. Even except for kids. I would say not kids. Hair was getting to be important. Wasn't quite there yet, but yeah, most business people wore hats. You listen to radio, it was AM, mono, no stereo. You might hear a stereo album if you had albums in a record player, but no. Your music you heard on the radio was all mono. The formats weren't all in one genre. Turn on a radio station. In most places, they would have maybe country music, or at the time called hillbilly music, in the morning. Then they have news, and they'd have classic music or jazzy music, and then they play the more popular stuff about the time kids got home from school, around 3 to 7. After that, it was whatever they wanted to play at night. But yeah, it was not like it is today, or not even like the 70s, where you had your album rock station, you had your jazz station, and on and on. That didn't exist in the 60s, at least not in the early 60s. By 1970, though, things had changed. If you wore a suit, that was very establishment and wasn't cool. Not for the kids, anyway. Your hair was long, and hats were rare. I mean, you may have had a hat, but it wasn't a fedora. And your TV was probably color by then. Almost all shows were in color by 1970. You had a transistor radio that you could walk around and listen to the music you wanted to hear, or listen to your radio. Didn't have anything but radio stations, but at least you could walk around and listen to your music. And things were getting a little more personal, and stereo was pretty much the law of the land, except for AM radio, which didn't have the capability of it. FM did, but that was later. 1960 had kind of a pause in rock and roll. Elvis had been in the Army since I think it's 57, so he hadn't been making music, and that kind of put a power vacuum. There were scandals all through the rock industry. From Jerry Lee Lewis's scandal to, well, almost all of them had some kind of scandal, and the media was just loved to pounce on it. Even, television of the time, like the Tonight Show's predecessor, were not friendly to rock and roll bands. So, yeah, it was, the start of the 60s was kind of very bland music. You had some, hillbilly music was popular with the southern states, which is where I lived. Doo-wop, crooners like the Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, those kind of guys. Some jazz was out there, was still popular. And if you were in a racially diverse family or area, or had those kind of leanings, then you probably were getting a lot of really, really good music from the African American community. I'm not talking just about the blues, but the blues were there. But funk was getting started in the early 60s. Wasn't quite up to the speed and that it would get to later, though. And with all that going on there and here, with everything being so squeaky clean, I mean, Elvis did get out of the Army in 1960, but he was recording movies. He was, filming. He wasn't doing rock and roll, really. I mean, it was rock-esque music in his movies, but they were, very Disney. I mean, they even had Disney character or stars from the old Disney shows from that period doing music with Elvis. So yeah, it was getting pretty pre-programmed and lame. It was just lame. And in the Britain, so they took the challenge. and the Beatles came to the United States. In 1964, that's when everything changed. We went from real rock and roll, from the old style rock and roll, to nothing, essentially, um, to what the Beatles came out with, and they came out with stuff that blew everybody's mind. From the excitement was palpable, and there was a reason for that. I mean, in 1963, near the end of 1963, JFK was shot and killed, obviously, and that it shocked America. I mean, it put America into a huge funk, and we weren't feeling like making music either. But we did need it. We really wanted something to bring us out of that funk. And 4 months after JFK was shot, the Beatles hit the tarmac at JFK or in New York, and it wasn't JFK then, I don't think. But the excitement was overwhelming. Like I said in my previous video, they could only tour until 1966 because the crowds were so loud. The screaming was just so loud that they couldn't hear themselves play, and nobody else could hear them play either. The human element overpowered the technology. The UK was different. They had grown up on our music and were ready to make some of their own based on our music, rock and roll, and they did. They there wasn't just the Beatles. There were other bands. The British Invasion was a real thing. The Kinks, the Zombies, the Who, the Rolling Stones, and several others, the Animals, and they were topping the U.S. charts, particularly the Beatles. In fact, there were not a whole lot of periods from 1964 to 66 where there wasn't a Beatles song at the very top of the Billboard charts all the time. But there were other things going on too, and they all influenced what became the 60s genre. That, like I said, it wasn't just the Beatles. Once they started flooding over here with British bands, American bands got off their ass. A lot of them were more protest and, had come out of the beat music and had started the hippie era. So some of it was, psychedelic music. Some of it was protest songs. But there was, a sense of, since the death of Kennedy, there seemed to be hope for a lot of things. We were in a space race with Russia at the time. Yeah, we were worried about getting blown up in our sleep, or, to be honest, I never saw the video about, duck and cover until I was an adult. I didn't see it when I was a kid, but we were aware of it. We were aware that if at any minute we could be in a nuclear war and all of us could die. There was reaction because of that too. I mean, that wasn't just the United States. You could get blown up all over the world, and a lot of people did get blown up, just not nuclearly.
Blown up real good.
But not only that, the civil rights movement was heating up, and I mean heating up. It had been, in the background, and things had been done in the 50s. There were some, violent clashes, but it really heated up in the 60s. And up until his death in 68, Martin Luther King was one of the forces in the United States that inspired a lot of the R&B writers and bands. And so, music wasn't getting written for everybody. Some bands were targeting their audiences, and they knew that there were enough of us that liked psychedelic music, for instance, that they could do that and kind of edge out all the other bands, and genres of music, just focus on that, and they would still make a lot of money. Same thing with the peace movement and beat music and things like that. There were certain types of people that's what they wanted to hear, and not everybody was into it, but it was still cool. It was still played on the radio. If you didn't like it, you changed station. Real simple. And then the elephant in the room, Vietnam. Vietnam may have been popular in 1960 when the decade started. But by 1966, it was not popular. It was very, very much on everybody's mind. If you were a teenager, you worried about whether you were going to get into a college and not have to get drafted. Because if you didn't go to college, you probably were going to get drafted. And if you were drafted, you were probably going to Vietnam. And this is for males, obviously, at the time. So when I say there were protest songs, it wasn't just about civil rights, although that was a big part of it. A lot of it, and most of it, I would say, was against the Vietnam War. A lot of music came out of that was incredible, just incredible. And I really regret that we don't have that now, considering how politicized and divided we are. We should have music. We should be having somebody singing about the things that we care about, regardless of which side you're on. So there were a lot of experimentation, like I said. Synthesizers were starting to get more common. They'd been invented, or mostly, the idea had been around for centuries, but synthesizers had really gotten invented in the 50s. By the 60s, you could have a synthesizer if you owned a studio. They were too big, they were bulky, you weren't taking them on a tour. It was not until the 70s that they got to a point where, like I said, Edgar Winter took a keyboard, put a strap around it, and put it around his neck, and all of a sudden you had the keytar, and synthesizers became common. But that was, a lot of the music from the 60s did rely on new sounds from synthesizers, new sounds from technology, new sounds from people like Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, he's one of the top 4 bands that I start with on the series, and that for very good reason. If you've never listened to Jimi Hendrix and you're a reactor, you're going to love this. Not just the fact that he made sounds that nobody had heard before, and not just the fact that he could play in ways that nobody had seen or tried before, but his performances were epic. And I use that word sparingly. I know a lot of reactors, you guys, you use it like every other word is epic. Oh, this is epic. But no, he was epic. And you're going to love Jimi Hendrix. You're going to love the 60s music, even though the technology doesn't sound as clean as later music did, but it hits a nerve. It doesn't matter. It was like the hippie music, for instance. Hippies are very misunderstood now. The hippie movement was not everybody who had long hair. They were people. It was almost a political movement based on the idea of promoting peace, promoting racial justice, promoting love, a communal lifestyle, sharing things, people helping people. They were very anti-war, and they were into psychedelics and drugs, and they felt like the government was bad. There were a lot of things I liked about the hippies, not all of it though. And they're not as cut and dried as you may think from what you've read in what history book or what you've heard from people who hate hippies or just kind of generalize. There was some subversive activity by teenagers, and that's what really drove rock and roll. So it's no surprise that adults hated it back then. And they said it wasn't music. They said it was subversive. They said it was the N-word music. There's a video. I'm going to try to find it, and if I find it, it'll be right here. I'll stick it right here.
As far as we're concerned in Anniston and Calhoun County, as long as the music is played like white people should play it, it's not this animalistic bebop, well, we won't object to it as long as it is a white band. But we don't want this nigger version of the rock and roll bop.
Bullshit. One more time. Bullshit. So music reflected this. There was, in fact, the more that the older generations pushed back, the more subversive it got, the more experimental it got, the more radical music got. And that ended up being a really good thing. So, I want to thank my grandparents and even my parents for hating the music that we were listening to, because you helped make sure that we got more of it. Up until that point, in fact, I would say especially through the 50s, most rock and roll was made for dancing. In the 60s, it wasn't really, there was dancing, but less dancing. In fact, when I see people react to things like the 67 Monterey Pop Festival, say, oh, they're just sitting around, man, they just heard the greatest solo of all time from Jimi Hendrix, and they're just sitting there, oh, yeah. No, they were wasted. They had been there for hours. They were exhausted. The camera didn't show everybody. There were plenty of people jumping up and down and screaming for Jimi Hendrix, but yeah, they were wasted. It was still good to them. They still, they may remember it still. But, one thing about the bands in the 60s, most of them did their best work in the 70s. The ones that survived the 60s, Beatles obviously didn't survive the 60s. The 27 Club, far too many of them didn't make it to the 70s. But the ones who did created a lot of really, really good stuff in the 70s. They didn't just go away. The Who did some of their best work in the 70s. The Rolling Stones did some of their best work in the 70s. Zeppelin came about in '69, so obviously they did their best work in the 70s. So as far as live music from the 60s, you're not going to find a lot of it that was really good. A lot of the videos that were done, like the Beatles videos, a lot of that was lip synced. You'll find some live performances. Technology wasn't necessarily best for those at the time, especially for bands like the Beatles and maybe even the Rolling Stones. However, things that were done for documentary purposes, like the Monterey Pop Festival, was a huge documentary done on it with a lot of the bands there and just some extraordinary performances. That is good. It's well recorded. It's an artsy film, so don't expect it to be like you're watching a concert video from now where everything is focused just on the band all the time. But the band is focused on, it's just different. Also Woodstock in 1969. One of the things about Woodstock, or about Jimi Hendrix, he was one of the top billed performers at Monterey, even though I think it was his first concert in the United States after coming back from England. But he was definitely the top bill at Woodstock. And two of his best performances are from those two shows. So yeah, you'll find some live stuff, especially from Hendrix, that is really, really worth watching. But a lot of it, things like American Bandstand had live music, but I think a lot of it was probably lip sync too. And I haven't seen a lot of American Bandstand clips on YouTube, so you may find it to react to, you may not. There was the Ed Sullivan Show, I think I mentioned in the first video. He introduced us to Elvis and the Beatles. And as far as other shows, there were some talk and variety shows that occasionally put music on. But yeah, you're not going to find a whole lot of quality live performances on bands from the 60s. But some that you will get asked to react to, and I highly recommend you listen to your audience in this, is Child in Time by Deep Purple. I think it was done on a European station. The recording that everybody reacts to, I had never seen until I started watching Reactors, and it blew my mind. I know it's going to blow yours. The Righteous Brothers, Unchained Melody. Not what you would expect. Not the band you would expect people to ask you to react to. But when you hear it, once again. Also, Sly and the Family Stone, Dance to the Music is I think probably their best song. It's their happy song, and there are several good live recordings of them on TV shows, at Woodstock, and I think probably others, probably Midnight Special, but that's the 70s. So enjoy your foray into the 1960s music. And to be honest, if you want to expand your education, there's only one decade, in my opinion, that surpasses the 1960s as far as musical creativity and just expression that just surpasses in every way, and that's the 1970s, which is the subject of our next video. So we're going to be releasing band-specific videos right after that, and I really hope you join us for all of it. Let the good times roll.